The fog is thick, clinging to the volcanic slopes of Attu like a shroud. It's the pre-dawn hours of May 29, 1943, for the American soldiers of the 7th Infantry Division. Hunkered down in their foxholes, the silence is the worst part. It's an unnatural quiet, broken only by the drip of water on rock and the ragged sound of their own breathing. They've been fighting for 18 days on this godforsaken island in the Aleutians, pushing the Japanese garrison back, step by bloody step. They think the end is near. Then, a sound pierces the fog. Not a rifle shot, not the crump of a mortar. A bugle, a single, mournful note that hangs in the damp air, quickly joined by another, and another. It's a sound that doesn't belong here, a sound from another century. Shouts echo from the Japanese lines, ghostly and distorted by the mist. Tenno Haika Banzai! For the Emperor, 10,000 years. Suddenly, the fog erupts. A wave of men, a human tide materializes from the gray. Bayonets are fixed, glinting dully in the nascent light. These aren't fresh troops. They're phantoms. Men with bandaged heads, limping on splintered legs, some with grenades clutched in their hands, their pins already pulled, held only by a desperate grip. They crash into the American lines, not at the strongest point, but where they are weakest, at the aid stations, the engineer depots, the artillery positions. It's chaos. The crack of Arisaka rifles mixes with the bark of M1 Garrisons. Men fight hand to hand in the mud, their breath misting in the frigid air. Medics and cooks, men who hadn't fired a shot in weeks, are now on the front line of a battle for survival. A single voice, captured later from a diary found clutched in a frozen hand, gives a name to this beautiful, terrible act. Gyokusai. To die like a shattered jewel. To choose an honorable death over the disgrace of surrender. This wasn't a moment of battlefield madness. It was doctrine. Forged in the 1941 Senjinkan the Field Service Code, which stated explicitly, "Do not be taken prisoner alive. A soldier of the Emperor does not surrender. He dies. But how? How does an entire army, an entire nation, convince its sons, ordinary men, farmers, fishermen, students, that death is not just an option, but a duty? What turns a man into a living weapon, willing to charge into certain annihilation for a cause?" This question would echo across the Pacific for the next 2 years. It would be asked in the humid, malarial jungles of Guadalcanal and on the coral sands of Tarawa, where the tide ran red. It would be whispered in the labyrinthine tunnels carved into the volcanic rock of Iwo Jima, under the watchful eye of General Kuribayashi. It would scream from the cliffs of Saipan and Okinawa, where General Ushijima and his staff chose ritual suicide over capture as their final act of command. Each island became a furnace, testing the limits of human endurance and the terrifying power of an idea. For every shattered jewel on one side, there was a life extinguished on the other, a family left waiting for a letter that would never arrive. The Banzai charge on Attu eventually faltered. The last of the Japanese soldiers, cornered and out of ammunition, turned their final grenades on themselves. The silence returns to the island, but it's a different kind of silence now. It's heavier, filled with the ghosts of what just happened. An American survivor, his ears still ringing, listens into the fog, half expecting to hear another bugle call, another charge. Deep in a cave on another island 1,000 miles away, a radio operator transmits a final fading message before the static takes over. The war is far from over. The doctrine of Gyokusai has only just begun to show its true devastating cost. And the largest, most ferocious battles are yet to come. The answer lies not on the battlefield, but in the mind. To understand why a soldier would choose death over surrender, we must go back to the Japan of the early Showa era. Imagine a schoolboy in 1941. From his earliest days, he's taught that the greatest honor is to serve the emperor, a divine being descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu. His nation is sacred, his duty absolute. The individual is nothing. The state is everything. This isn't just patriotism. It's a spiritual obligation, drilled into him through endless repetition in the classroom and at home. Then he becomes a soldier. He's handed the Field Service Code, issued by General Hideki Tojo. It's not a set of guidelines. It's a sacred text. And one line burns itself into his soul. Never live to experience the shame of being taken prisoner. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a command from the highest authority, both military and spiritual. Surrender meant more than personal failure. It brought unbearable shame upon his family, his village, his ancestors. His parents would be ostracized. His name would be erased from family records. Capture was a fate worse than death, a spiritual stain that could never be cleansed. This ideology was hammered home through brutal training. Recruits were systematically broken down. Beatings were common, not just for infractions, but to build a tolerance for pain and an unquestioning obedience. Compassion was equated with weakness. Mercy, for oneself or the enemy, was a failing. The mythical code of Bushido, the way of the warrior, was repurposed. Historically a complex ethical system for the samurai class, it was simplified into a fanatical death cult. Loyalty, obedience, and the glorious death in battle. But then, this rigid ideology met the messy, horrifying reality of jungle warfare. On Guadalcanal and in New Guinea, the abstract glory of the emperor met the concrete misery of mud, malaria, and starvation. Japanese logistics, stretched thin across the Pacific, collapsed. Soldiers were told to live off the land, but the jungle offered little more than insects and poisonous plants. Units were ordered to hold positions at all costs, even when their supply lines were severed and they were reduced to skeletons in tattered uniforms. An officer, his unit about to be annihilated, might radio back to headquarters a final chilling message. All troops performed Gyokusai, the shattering of the jewel, a poetic euphemism for annihilation. A declaration that every single man fought to the last. There was no plan for retreat, no provision for surrender. Faced with impossible odds, the Banzai charge evolved. It wasn't just a human wave attack. It was part desperate tactic, part final ritual. Often launched under the cover of darkness, it was a last-ditch effort to break through American lines and sow chaos. But more often than not, it was a form of mass suicide, a way to meet the end on their feet, screaming for the emperor, rather than wasting away from disease or starvation. For the American Marines and soldiers facing them, it was terrifying and bewildering. One GI from the 25th Infantry Division later recalled, "You'd hear them start screaming in the dark, Banzai. It chilled you to the bone. We had to mow them down. You felt fear, but also a kind of pity. Why wouldn't they just quit?" We didn't understand it. We get a glimpse into the other side from a diary found on a fallen Japanese soldier on Guadalcanal. Beneath the patriotic rhetoric, there's raw human fear. "I am thirsty. The shelling never stops. We have eaten the last of our rice. Will I see my mother's face again? I think only of a glorious death, but my hands tremble. The rhetoric demanded a hero's death, but the body still feared it." As the war ground on and the Allies began their relentless island-hopping campaign, this doctrine of no surrender became codified in steel and stone. Evacuation was no longer an option. The islands became fortresses designed for a single purpose: to bleed the Americans for every inch of ground. On islands like Tarawa, the defenders were told they were the final breakwater against a tide that would engulf Japan itself. On the limestone ridges of Peleliu, Japanese engineers and Korean laborers spent months carving a labyrinth of interconnected caves, pillboxes, and tunnels. They were not building defenses to be held. They were carving out a massive island-sized tomb. Inside these dark, sweltering caves, they stockpiled ammunition, mortar, and crates of grenades, preparing not just to fight, but to die. Every man knew his final duty. When the Americans came, he was to take as many of them with him as possible until the very last grenade. The year is 1943. The Pacific is a furnace. The island-hopping campaign, designed to bring American forces closer and closer to Japan, has become a relentless, brutal slog. On the tiny atoll of Tarawa, Marines wade ashore into a storm of machine gun fire. The fighting is so intense, so close that it becomes a gruesome, hand-to-hand struggle over every inch of sand. Only a handful of Japanese defenders are taken alive. The lesson learned is a terrifying one. Surrender is not an option. This grim reality hardens as the campaign moves to Peleliu in 1944. Here, the Japanese defenders have turned the island into a fortress. They've burrowed into the coral ridges, creating a labyrinth of interconnected bunkers and caves, all positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire. For the Americans, it's a meat grinder. Night after night, demolition teams crawl forward under the cover of darkness, carrying satchel charges to blast sealed cave entrances. They push deeper into a defender's nightmare, where every shadow could hold an enemy, and every cave could be a tomb. The fighting is slow, agonizing, and incredibly costly. Again, prisoners are almost non-existent. The Japanese doctrine of fight to the last man is no longer a strategy. It's a sacred, terrifying oath. And then comes Saipan. This is where the war's character shifts from brutal to apocalyptic. Saipan is not just a military outpost, it's home to thousands of Japanese civilians. As the Marines storm the beaches and fight their way inland, they face the most sophisticated defensive network yet. But here, the collision is not just between soldiers. It's between armies and families, between warfare and humanity. The Japanese commander, General Yoshitsugu Saito, knows the battle is lost. He issues a final order demanding annihilation, not surrender, then performs seppuku. Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagamo, the architect of Pearl Harbor, follows suit, choosing suicide over the shame of capture. This leadership cult of death cascades down to the troops and, horrifically, to the civilian population. In Tokyo, the propaganda machine goes into overdrive, promoting the idea of ichioku Gyokusai the 100 million shattered jewels. The entire population of Japan must be prepared to die rather than surrender. On Saipan, this isn't just a slogan. It becomes a devastating reality. Rumors, amplified by fear and years of indoctrination, spread like wildfire. The Americans are monsters who will torture and brutalize anyone they capture. This propaganda takes root in the island's northern cliffs. The Americans, desperate to stop the unfolding tragedy, try everything. They drop leaflets promising safety and good treatment. They set up loudspeakers, with Nisei interpreters, Japanese Americans in U.S. uniforms, risking their lives under friendly and enemy fire, pleading in fluent Japanese for people to come out of the caves, to surrender, to live. They beg them not to believe the lies, but for many it's too late. The fear is too deep. On the edge of what will become known as Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff, a scene of unimaginable horror unfolds. Families gather at the precipice. Some use shirts or scraps of cloth to tie blindfolds over their children's eyes. They clutch them tight, whisper final words, and step into the abyss, choosing the rocks and the churning sea below over capture. Some are coerced by soldiers, but many go willingly, convinced they are saving their families from a fate worse than death. It is a devastating spectacle of manipulated fear and misplaced honor. The fall of Saipan is a strategic catastrophe for Japan. For the first time, the home islands are within range of America's new long-range bomber, the B-29 Superfortress. The war is no longer a distant affair fought on remote islands. It is coming home. In the hushed, panicked halls of Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, as the reality of Saipan sinks in, military planners look at their maps. They see the next logical step, the next inevitable fortress island on the path to Japan. A new name is whispered, one that will soon be etched in history with blood and volcanic ash. Iwo Jima. Deep beneath the black sands of Iwo Jima, a new kind of war was waiting. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had turned the volcanic island into a fortress, not of beach defenses, but of honeycombed tunnels, pillboxes, and caves. He gave his men a chillingly simple order. There would be no glorious, wasteful Banzai charges. Instead, they were to stay hidden, fight from the earth itself, and each man was to kill 10 Americans before he died. He was preparing for a war of attrition, a slow, methodical bleed. When the U.S. Marines landed, they met an eerie silence. The beaches were strangely uncontested. They pushed inland, thinking it was easier than expected. And then the island erupted. From unseen holes in the rock, from camouflaged spider holes and reinforced concrete bunkers, a storm of machine gun fire and mortar shells tore into them. The enemy wasn't charging. They were waiting, hidden, turning every yard of advance into a lethal guessing game. For over a month, the fighting was a claustrophobic nightmare of flamethrowers and grenades thrown into dark tunnels, a desperate hunt for an enemy who had become part of the island itself. Out of a garrison of over 21,000 Japanese soldiers, only a few dozen were taken prisoner. The rest fought, as commanded, to the last man. Iwo Jima was a shock to the American psyche, a brutal lesson in what it meant to face an enemy who had completely surrendered the idea of survival. But it was only a prelude. Next came Okinawa, a far larger, more populated island just 340 miles from mainland Japan. Here, the last stand ethos mutated into something even more horrific. This wasn't just a battle between professional soldiers. The Japanese military had conscripted Okinawan civilians, men and boys, into fighting units. High school girls were organized into nursing corps, tending to the dying and muddy, candlelit caves. The entire island became a battlefield, trapping hundreds of thousands of civilians between two colossal armies. The American advance was met with the same tenacious, interlocking defense as on Iwo Jima, but on a vast, island-wide scale. The spring rains turned the battlefield into a quagmire of mud and corpses, a landscape of rot and disease. Every ridge, every ravine, every tomb had to be taken by cave combat. Marines and soldiers used flamethrowers to sear the openings of caves, then threw in satchel charges to silence whatever was left inside. The fighting was intimate, savage, and relentless. In the south, at the final command post on Hill 89, General Matsuru Ushijima and his fiery subordinate, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, faced the inevitable. With their lines collapsing, they made their final decision. Dressed in full ceremonial uniform, they knelt, facing north toward the imperial palace, and committed ritual suicide. But before they did, they unleashed one last desperate order. Remnants of their shattered army, along with conscripted civilians armed with spears, surged forward in a final hopeless charge. It broke like a wave against the unyielding wall of American firepower. Overhead, the sky told the same story. This was the peak of the kamikaze campaign. Young pilots, many of them barely out of their teens, wrote final letters home, wrapped themselves in hachimaki headbands, and flew their bomb-laden planes directly into the U.S. fleet. Each plume of smoke on the horizon was a pilot fulfilling his duty, turning himself into a guided missile. It was the aerial expression of the same code being enacted in the caves below. Victory or annihilation. The cost was staggering. But as the battle for Okinawa drew to a close, a dreadful strategic realization began to dawn on American planners. They looked at the casualty lists, at the sheer fanaticism of the defense, at the willingness to sacrifice not just soldiers but civilians. If one small island, a prefecture of Japan, had cost this much blood, what would an invasion of the home islands look like? What would happen when they landed on Kyushu, and then on Honshu toward Tokyo itself? From a radio in Tokyo, a voice crackled across the airwaves, promising the glorious death of 100 million. On the strategic maps in Allied headquarters, the arrows pushed ever closer, sliding across the ocean from the nightmare of Okinawa, pointing directly at the heart of Japan. August 1945. A sound pierces through the crackle of radio static across the vast Pacific theater. It's not a bugle call or the roar of an engine, but a voice never before heard by the public. Emperor Hirohito. His words, delivered in a formal, high-pitched tone, are almost incomprehensible to many. But the key phrase cuts through the confusion. Endure the unendurable and suffer what is insufferable. This was it. The war was over. For millions of soldiers, conditioned for years to fight to the last breath, this was a psychological earthquake. The atomic bombs had incinerated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union, a silent giant, had suddenly declared war, shattering Japanese forces in Manchuria. The divine wind had not blown. The gods had not intervened. Now only surrender remained. The reaction on the front lines was a chaotic mix of shock, grief, and disbelief. Imagine a soldier, his finger on the trigger, suddenly being told to stop. In some units, men broke down, weeping openly as they laid down their rifles, weapons they had been taught were extensions of their own spirit. They bowed towards the imperial palace one last time. In other sectors, the fighting didn't stop. The emperor's decree was dismissed as enemy propaganda. Officers had to personally stand before their men, sometimes in the middle of a firefight, and read the imperial rescript aloud, their voices cracking with emotion. Only then, with a direct order from their commander, would the guns fall silent. It was a whiplash of emotions, a sudden halt to a lifetime of momentum. The surrender was not a single clean event. It was a collection of countless small, intensely human dramas playing out across thousands of islands. A soldier in Okinawa, his hand trembling, reaches for the small cyanide ampule he'd been ordered to use to avoid capture. He brings it to his lips, then hesitates. The emperor's voice echoes in his mind. He lets it drop. Elsewhere, a young Japanese-American Nisei interpreter stands at the mouth of a dark cave. He doesn't shout threats. Instead, he calls out in perfect Japanese, offering not death, but rice balls and cigarettes. Slowly, cautiously, figures emerge from the darkness, starved and exhausted, blinking in the sunlight. And then, the most surreal sight of all, from pillboxes and jungle ravines where only defiance had existed, small white flags, a tattered shirt, a piece of parachute silk began to rise. The symbol of surrender, so despised and alien to their code, was now their only path to survival. But the doctrine of Gyokusai, the shattering of the jewel, or fighting to the last man, did not simply vanish overnight. Its roots were too deep. Pockets of resistance fought on for days, weeks, even months, convinced the surrender was a trick or a betrayal of their honor. This fierce loyalty led to one of the most haunting legacies of the war, the holdouts. Men like Sergeant Shoichi Yokoi, discovered in the jungles of Guam in 1972, and Lieutenant Hiru Onoda, who finally surrendered in the Philippines in 1974. For nearly 30 years, they had remained at their posts, bound by their last orders and a profound sense of shame at the idea of returning defeated. Their stories are a testament to the incredible power of duty and the psychological scars left by the conflict. Reflecting on the cost is staggering. The POW rate for Japanese soldiers was incredibly low for most of the war, a direct result of the no-surrender policy. This meant catastrophic numbers of killed in action. For the American forces who faced this fanaticism, the experience was brutal and scarring, shaping a generation of veterans. In the aftermath, Japan as a nation underwent a radical transformation, renouncing militarism in its new constitution. Yet for the individual veterans, the return home was complex. They were not heroes of a victorious war, but survivors of a catastrophic defeat, left to grapple with their memories in a nation desperately trying to forget. The bugle that once called them to battle, to sacrifice, to certain death, was now silent. Its silence hangs over the quiet memorials and the aging photographs, a solemn reminder of the courage and the tragedy, honoring the human spirit without ever romanticizing the brutal reality of war. The stories from this era are endless, each one a window into the human condition under extreme pressure. We'll be exploring more of these untold narratives, including a deeper dive into the crucial role of the Nisei linguists, who bridged the gap between enemies. If you want to continue this journey with us, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Thank you for watching.